Hi there, Gwen again. Last week I talked a bit about um, internalized misogyny and how it relates to cultural relational trauma and intergenerational trauma. And today I want to talk about collective trauma and what that is and what I mean by that and how it relates to our internalized misogyny, as well as all of the other biases that we have been socialized and that we all carry within ourselves. This is the third in a four-part series called, what did I call it? On ancestral trauma and internalized misogyny. And it's all introducing the ideas, themes, topics that we're going to be exploring in my next online intimate women's circle called Unleashing Ourselves, Processing Ancestral Trauma and Dislodging Internalized Misogyny. And the link to that is down in the description if you want. So in the essay that goes with this video, I explain what collective trauma is and the different ways that we can experience collective trauma. Natural disasters are one way that we experience collective trauma, that communities experience collective trauma. The mass shootings that are happening would also be a collective trauma. Anyone who was in the most recent school in Parkland, Florida, would be a part of that collective that experienced that particular collective trauma. Genocides, refugees often have what is called collective trauma because typically they are escaping from genocide and or extremely authoritarian regimes where it's the domination is incredibly traumatic. All of those things, right? So it can be anything from a hurricane to a genocide. Can be a collective trauma. It's anything that we experience as a community. Whatever that community is, it doesn't necessarily have to be with our neighbors, but it can be with our people, however we choose to define that, be that our ethnicity, our religious affiliation, any of those things, right? It can also be our literal, it can be our neighborhood too. And I view misogyny, and particularly internalized misogyny for women, to be a collective trauma. If we look back again, last time I talked about the witch trials from the mid last millennia, and how that had the impacts on the individuals and how that was a part of our ancestral trauma that was passed down because each individual internalized and viewed and was witness to these traumatic events and likely not processed. And then, but also, while it is true that it is an ancestral and an individual type of bloodline type of trauma, it is also true that it is a collective trauma, that all women who, or all people really, who had family who lived in Europe during the time of those witch trials have a collective trauma. We were all there, right? And that collective trauma has then been passed forward and passed forward. So that's the historical piece of ancestral trauma, right? And the way that the subjugation of women has been perpetuated throughout history. And then we have how it is still an ongoing, living, breathing collective trauma, living in a patriarchal culture and a misogynist culture where women are hated. We are hated. We are not respected. We are not treated as humans, as fully human. We are not considered to be individuals. We are considered to be property, and we don't know our own bodies. We don't know our own minds. We don't know what's right for ourselves, etc., etc. We can't have our own voice. That's problematic, right? It could be argued that perhaps living today, it is less traumatic. The collective trauma of our patriarchal culture may be less traumatic. I think that we see signs of that being possibly true when we look at the Me Too movement and we see women speaking up more and more and more and becoming more and more outraged at the ways we have all been treated. And also, there is still the reality that our leaders are white men who don't want us to have rights to our body, who don't want us to have a voice, who have admitted to sexual assault and there has been no repercussions for, right? So while we have the vote, so to speak, on paper, we also are really having to constantly fight for our rights to be individual, autonomous human beings. And that is a trauma that we all experience as women. Different women, depending on color of skin, depending on able-bodiedness, depending on sexuality, depending on gender identification, right? Depending on all of these things, will experience this collective trauma in different ways. So we're all part of many different collectives, and we all feel those impacts and those intersections in our own individual and then collective ways. It's important to recognize this again and to really, for us to broaden the definition of trauma beyond that of which I have personally or you have personally experienced in this life, that we expand the definition of trauma from singular acute events to chronic events, chronic and perpetual events like abuse, but also that we continue to expand that definition to include the perpetual abuse, domination, rejection of humanity that our culture imparts on us, inflicts on us, actually, and how we internalize that, how we buy into it, and then how we pass it on. Because it's all a both and, right? We are complicit victims, so to speak. We have the, we are both on the receiving end, and we also help dole it out. And this shows up in the ways that we judge other women. This shows up in the ways that we are critical of our daughters and not as critical of our sons. This shows up in, in all kinds of ways, the way we compete with other women, the way we have difficulty having really close, intimate, not sexual, but emotionally intimate relationships with other women, the ways we are not really in community the way we used to be many, many, many thousands of years ago as women in more egalitarian cultures or even matriarchal cultures. All of this impacts us, all of this informs us, all of this influences us. And the more we become aware of it, the more we become aware of these different types of traumas and how they are impacting not only the way we act and our thought process, but also impact our bodies and our nervous systems and the way we're able to connect to boundaries and all of those things, right? All of those things that come with personal lived experience trauma also come with ancestral trauma and cultural trauma and collective trauma. All of this, right? It all impacts our systems and our bodies, which all then, right, snowballs and influences how we are in the world. So again, this is the third of 4 videos that have accompanying essays. You can read the link, if you're watching this on YouTube, the link to this essay that goes with this video is down there in the description. If you are reading this in my newsletter or my blog, you've read the essay. And here's the video. This goes along with, is introducing the ideas of a 6-month intimate online circle that I'm offering, that I offer every spring on ancestral trauma. I've offered every spring for the last few years. And you can learn more about that. That's, again, in a link below. There'll be one more video next week, and I look forward to connecting with you. Thank you.